So today I thought I would talk about the big five a little bit and how God uses that and what kind of people some of the folks in the Bible are and what the purpose of different type of people might be for God's plans. And I was thinking about Adam and Eve, and the fall. And this is something that's, there's a lot of debate about, was it necessary? How much did God know it was going to happen? It seems like it happens really, really quick after the world is created. Like, there wasn't a lot of time for Adam and Eve to experience the goodness before the fall happened. And this, of course, paints a picture of God as being somewhat cruel because he's deprived man of, the positive experience. If only Adam hadn't messed up, perhaps we could have gotten to a place where all of this other stuff wasn't necessary. Now, I reject all that because I think that God is omniscient, and what's more, I do believe that he creates people for the purposes that he creates them for. And I think that Adam might have been a rather disagreeable person. And that might be a strange thing to say. I don't know. And I think agreeableness versus disagreeableness is one of those kind of character traits that we tend to think of as a good and a bad. Like agreeableness is good and disagreeableness is bad. And if that and I don't think that's too accurate. That's very naive because obviously God makes all sorts of people and uses them for all sorts of things, and it's not one person that does everything the best. And Jordan Peterson's talked a little bit about that, about how there are some people who are super low in agreeableness, and it makes them able to make some really tough decisions, like the bosses that have to fire people. And because of that, that ultimately benefits people. It benefits the person getting fired because they're not stuck doing a job that they're ill-suited for. It benefits the company because the company's not wasting resources. And it benefits the disagreeable person because they actually enjoy that experience. And I was actually thinking that I can relate to that quite a bit because when I took the Big Five test, I was sort of in the middle of the pack, I think it was, on agreeableness, but it was almost all politeness and no compassion. And I think that's kind of a weird way that they word those things because I do think that I am a compassionate person in a lot of ways, but I realize that what I think when it's saying compassion, I don't have a lot of sympathy or pity for the undeserving people. Insofar as people get themselves into situations by their own choosing, and they probably should have known better, I have no desire to bail them out because I think they need to, they've made their bed and now they need to lie in it. So I can understand that disagreeableness as being somewhat of a virtue because it means that, I'm also way on the introverted side, which means that most people probably wouldn't know how disagreeable I am because unless if it's really something that I think is worth picking a fight about, I will tend to just disagree in private. And of course, this YouTube channel is a little bit unbalanced in that regard because the whole point is for me to speak my thoughts. But it's easier for me to speak my thoughts into a void rather than face-to-face to another person, especially if I'm sharply disagreeing with something they said. And in this sense, I'm more or less disagreeing with a sort of, nebulous YouTube conversation about various topics. And I'm just giving my 2 cents rather than contributing to the consensus when I disagree with things. And I do think that is a good thing about the way that God made me, because, for instance, I think there's some real problems with the personality that's just too sympathetic to everything. Now we have these crises about like gender and the postmodern thing, and no one can say anything to anybody about it, about their own secret, sacred self. And the disagreeable person comes along and says, you got to start taking some responsibility for yourself, much like what a lot of Jordan Peterson's messaging was. And, so I think that can be a good thing. Now, I was thinking about this in regards to Adam and why he may be a disagreeable person. And I think, we really have very little interaction that we see with Adam. God gives him his commands in the beginning. You can eat of all these trees, but not this one. He tells him to name the animals, which he does. We don't know if he put up any sort of fight. I don't necessarily think he did. God brought the animals to him. I think that was probably a task for which he was well suited, and it was enjoyable. And then, of course, at that point, he understood that there was no suitable helper for him. God put him to sleep. He created the woman. Adam woke up, and he was so excited to see the woman. Whatever his disagreeableness was, it wasn't like, 100%. I think that might be the character of the devil. I think that, if anything, Satan may be, in some sense, just pure contrariness to the will of God. And not in the sort of, but, it is a subtle thing. It says it's subtle. It's a nuanced thing. He pushes the boundaries. He questions like the motives, and he's very particular in his critiques of things to cause a lot of confusion. He really is a kind of a postmodernist thinker in his communication, at least in that third chapter of Genesis. And so, I think you could say that maybe Adam had some disagreeableness, and the devil had a little bit more. But I also thought, Adam is disagreeable in the sense of he's created in the image and likeness of God, and God did create him to multiply, to create, to bring order, to exert control over his environment, to tame the wildness. All these things are very God-like characteristics. But one thing that's not reflected in the nature of God in that sense is a submissive attitude. Because it's very hard to say to someone, I want you to be in charge of everything, but I'm going to be in charge of you. Well, if that person's like super timid and agreeable, they're going to have a really hard time taking initiative. They're going to have a really hard time being productive without asking a million questions. And that's not a suitable person for the task. So I think Adam probably was someone who didn't have a lot of worry. He didn't about his choices. He probably, thought extremely quickly and acted accordingly. He wasn't second guessing himself, I guess you could say. And then, but in that, the character of God is like that. God doesn't just willingly submit to us. We say prayers to God, trying to ask him to do our bidding all the time. But that's not what he does. He does what he wants to do. And as our Father in heaven, he oftentimes withholds from us things that we ask for because he knows it's for our best interests. Well, God doesn't feel any compulsion to acquiesce to our desires simply because we are asking. So he is very not agreeable in that way. God's going to do what God wants to do. because he's God and he knows best. And I think that, part of the problem there is that Adam has that mindset as well. And he's okay with this thing of this one thing that God told him not to do until it's challenged and brought up. And of course, there is the element in that the woman is the one who's deceived. And I think there is some truth to this thing, that Adam was fearful of losing a woman, being left out, and of course, then what he does is he blames her for everything. And I think that that's a pattern that you can see throughout the biblical text and history as well, is that men are often blaming women for their problems, unjustly, I would say. But as I'm thinking about this now, it's like, what is that disagreeableness? So that in the proper context, even though maybe that disagreeable nature is some of what caused Adam to decide, I can do my own thing here. I can make this choice, and it's okay. Like, that was probably a totally fine attitude for him to have in regard to every other circumstance, how he wanted to take care of the garden and rule the animals and cultivate the earth and all those things. And I think that is telegraphed in a way through his sons, through Cain and Abel, because Cain is the disagreeable one, and Abel is very much the submissive one. And there's some really interesting dynamics Jacob pointed out in his one of his Bible study videos about this male and female, masculine and feminine aspect that's present in their names there. And so I think that, Cain is the epitome of this super disagreeable type of person, because he gets offended when God doesn't accept his sacrifice. He doesn't listen when God tells him to avoid sin. And then when God calls him out, he more or less is rude to God, or he has a very, very, very difficult time admitting that he's wrong, repenting. And I think that after that whole experience, God curses him with this mark, he does repent. I think that is the pattern that's shown in his life, because he ends up fulfilling the commands that God wanted him to do. But it was in a different way. So God, and I think that's the pattern. When somebody's disagreeableness keeps them from serving God, God will take away more and more things to put them in a position where they need to submit and show God the honor he deserves and obey him. He humbles the proud. And I think that pride is very much a characteristic of a disagreeable personality. Because those who are very agreeable will be humble. They will take direction well. There's very little, if it's true agreeableness, there's very little pride in them. Because they're not thinking of themselves. And there could be people who take pride in performative actions and may seem like they're being very agreeable, but they are resentful. That's kind of the story of the older brother in the parable of the prodigal son. He looks like a person who's very agreeable and submissive, but he's really not. He believes that he deserves everything he gets because of his effort. So he's taken in that sense, in that story, Cain and Abel are really reversed, because the older brother, the prodigal son, is the disagreeable one. But because neither of them knows the father, the older brother looks at the father with fear and obeys because he's afraid of the consequences of disobedience. The younger brother doesn't know the father and looks at him as just a provider of good things. He looks for the hand and not the heart. And, it's only when he's been given the material wealth and loses it that he begins to see that truly what his father had to offer was the loving, accepting household that he provided for his sons. So they, but he is the, but he doesn't push back on things. He is more agreeable than the older brother, I would say, and he humbles himself. But that's neither here nor there. It's not perfect parallel, but kind of an interesting thing I just thought. But this disagreeable thing, so is that bad? Is that what God's trying to rid humanity of? I don't think so. I think that it is a really important part of the human personality, but it needs very much to be brought under submission to God and to God's will. And if it's not, then it can have some very devastating consequences, which is kind of the world before the flood, where there's chaos everywhere, all sorts of crazy stuff's going on. It's a world of destruction because everybody is in contention with everybody else. Disagreeableness is the thing that is ruling, and perhaps Noah is the man, perfect in his generations, who has less of that. Now, I think there's always, when you are living in a time where the culture is very worldly and evil, then it is on the part of the disagreeable person. The disagreeableness is necessary to be holy because you have to resist what the world is trying to get you to do. And this was something I was really thinking about a lot because my wife and I were watching the documentary series on Netflix about the fundamentalist Mormon church, and it was this super creepy cult, essentially, and this, it was a polygamist organization, and this old guy who was running it, and then his son took over, and he was way worse, and he just started really, turning the screws on all of the indoctrination, the control of information, behavior, emotions, thoughts. Behavior, information, thoughts, emotions. BITE is an acronym that for cultish influence. So those are the things they're always interested in controlling. And if that's what your church is like, then it might be a cult. But I was watching this. This guy at the top is obviously pure evil. He's and most of the people don't even know. The stuff that they do know is bad enough. Where has 78 wives, and a lot of them are teenagers, he's taking these women from one guy and giving them to another. They basically, he's in control of who everybody's married to, and he trades women around as commodities to control people and blackmail them, and he uses his power to kick people out or let them stay in to manipulate them, takes people's businesses away from them, all this crazy stuff. But then even behind the scenes, he's doing even worse stuff, really gross things with children, basically, he's a pedophile. But he manipulated all these people, and they had been, for the most part, brought up in this. And it's the interesting thing is what these good people in a bad, crooked worldview end up doing. And it was clear from the people that were speaking to the documentary makers that those who got out of it, they realized wow, I was pretty much brainwashed, and it took some really terrible thing to get them to snap out of it. But so many of these people, and many of them stayed in, and we're still participating in it. They are very agreeable persons, and it was actually the the sad part, I think, is that well, so the leader ended up kicking out most of the men, and he kicked out especially all the men that had any kind of backbone, and all the men that were kind of decent. Now these people are all polygamists, so that's kind of weird, but that's kind of an understandable fantasy. I mean, I guess in some ways you could say at least the men in that society were trying to fulfill their fantasy of having multiple women by being married and committed to all of them. So it's better than just, people that make no commitments to any women. It's sketchy and weird and not, obviously, I think that's not a good biblical teaching. You have to really, just because it happened in parts of the scripture doesn't mean at any point it's actually condoned. It was more or less God just telling people how to behave within the context of the sinful decisions they already decided they were going to make. But all the men that were decent got kicked out. All the men that stayed in were the ones who were really able to be manipulated by being given more women, or they were willing to do unsavory tasks and all this stuff. So that's really corrupt. But the women were, for the most part, there was a couple where it seems like they lied and they did some they pushed, they were a little, they went along with some bad direction. But a lot of these women really thought that they were doing a great thing by being in this organization and being super committed to it, because they were following the words of this prophet, and they had so much agreeableness and devotion that I think from a character standpoint, it would be very hard to fault them if they were in any other context besides this weird polygamist cult. And because of that, it's just very hard to find fault in them in some ways, because these are women that have been more or less neglected from a lot of outside information, from decent education, from access to anything except for an extremely controlling point of view. And the women who actually kind of broke out of this system and helped to get this guy arrested and bring about some justice were the troublesome women who were all much more independent, and I would say they definitely had the personality trait of disagreeableness. And that's one of those things where typically women are more agreeable than men. But these women who are more disagreeable were able to do a lot of good in protecting future people, getting families and children out of this situation, getting this guy arrested. Now, he apparently still runs the place from prison, which is kind of crazy. People are just so brainwashed that there's a lot of people that are still committed to this cult. And that, I think that's something that Jordan Peterson's talked about, that in some ways, when you have a society that's full of really good people, good in this sense, of these kind of agreeable people, they can really be taken advantage of by a psychopath. When some sort of a psychopath or sociopath, narcissistic, crooked, evil person comes in, they can just run amok because they basically feed off of that undeserved trust and take total advantage of it, and they can just do real havoc. And so the agreeableness is a good thing if the people are living within a context where truth is valued, where there are good systems in place, where people behave morally and all this stuff. But they can become victims very quickly if the leadership turns to in a wicked direction. And so in that sense, that disagreeable nature was really important for breaking this system. And I think, we could look back at a lot of other times and see a similar thing. I think that's part of what's good about the American the American mindset in some ways. The concepts of the founding fathers and their willingness to revolt. It really came. It came through the Protestant Reformation, through John Calvin, who really influenced. John Knox studied with him, formed the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, and through that tradition in Scotland, you have people like Samuel Rutherford, who wrote the book Lex Rex about the law and the prince, or the law and the king. And what he did was, through this Protestant mindset of, really trying to not be deceived, I would say, and not just following authority blindly, and that's the legacy of the Protestant Reformation. He really pushed back against this concept that was present in England, and even more so in the Catholic countries, about the divine right of kings, and that God has appointed a king over a nation, and therefore it is wrong to question his will and his intentions, and the agreeable people will just go along with that and say, of course. But what happens is when that king becomes unjust. And at that point, you have a nation that's in the same position as one of these cults. The cult is like a little microcosm of a nation. When everything is great when everybody's following all the rules. And even if the founder, like Joseph Smith, I think, was a manipulative person. I think he founded Mormonism, put in a lot of this stuff about polygamy to suit his own needs. But because he got a lot of decent people to follow him, most of the church ended up rejecting that in a few generations. And, those who held on to it were probably a bit corrupt in some sense, because they were, desiring this polygamous lifestyle for themselves. But every time you have good people crop up in these situations, they don't see it as this obviously this is a manipulative system designed to keep people under control and to take advantage of them. They are good-hearted and good-intentioned, and so they actually, in a sense, sort of redeem it. They believe all of the lies that the manipulator says about the thing, and in their experience, and they actually experience the sort of good-natured feeling that the corrupt person is incapable of, because the corrupt leaders are always living a double life. So I would say it's the same thing in these nations where, people who look to the king and, and believe that he is God's anointed authority for their nation, they're patriotic, they're good citizens, they obey the laws, they do everything right. But at some point, if that king becomes corrupt, those people will just continuously bow to the higher and higher demands, higher taxes, more egregious laws, taking advantage of people in more and more ways, and they will almost never push back. But through this line of Protestant thinking, the writers of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence really did push back and say, no, just because somebody made you a king, it wasn't actually God himself, or, it was people and then other people and other people. And it's okay to have a king, but the king has to be a servant of the people, because he's not categorically better than them. And that's the thinking that Christianity really tore down in the Roman Empire. All the nations before the time of Christ, they thought that their leaders were divine. They thought that their emperors and kings were were descended from the gods, and therefore they were in a categorically different place from the citizens, and they could impose their will, and it was unassailable and unquestionable. Whereas in Christianity, we do have a man who is divine at the head of our system, but the one who is the greatest, the one who's the most deserving of being obeyed and followed and treated as categorically different, instead actually becomes like the lowest and sacrifices himself. And in doing so, he elevates the rights of all people. And so, this long process, thousands of years, I think in a sense, it works to redeem that disagreeable nature, where now the disagreeable one can be the person who stands up for what is right in the context of a wicked generation. And so, that's what I was thinking about in regards to these women. The ones that the cult leaders pointed out as being problematic, and troublesome. They tried to control them by having them married off at like 14 years old, and of course that backfired because they ended up running away and finding real civilization and getting some investigative reporters, lawyers, police, and people involved, and getting this guy arrested. It's not like a done deal, as I said. There's so many people in this, and there's many other cults, other situations similarly. But I think that we have to see, in some sense, there's to me something beautiful about the way that God uses like a disagreeable, grumpy, stubborn person, and that's the one who's going to do maybe the most good in delivering a bunch of kind-hearted people from being abused. And I was thinking of this, of course, it comes from my more Calvinist thinking. And people often say, like, oh, total depravity, so bad, what a terrible concept. I'm not totally depraved. I'm not a worse of a sinner than somebody who's a murderer. What a terrible doctrine. And of course, as many people have rightly pointed out, it doesn't mean that you are, obviously not everybody can be the worst. But, what you do is a reflection of some of your personality, and what you think is also a reflection of your personality. And the one who does the observable sin, may not in fact be worse than the person who doesn't, because they just have a personality that expresses itself in that way. And as I said earlier, I'm an introverted person, but I am somewhat disagreeable. So that my personality is what keeps me from picking a lot of fights with people. Not because I don't think they're stupid, or that they say stupid things, or that I want to argue with them. I just more or less say, it's not worth the effort. And that's what keeps me from doing it. It's not because I'm a better or a holier person. So I think that it's actually by far the other concept, the concept that, people are born good, or that you can be good, or that the only thing that matters is the way that you are presenting on the outside. That is what creates a greater psychological burden on people. And I think the evidence of that is that these people who are the most agreeable, and in many senses, like the women in this cult, they're the most, I would say, holy in their attitudes. They're really devoted, and they see this as an act of service to God to behave this way. And what the result of it is that they're just constantly letting themselves be abused and taken advantage of. And they're not sinning. Some of them may be, if they realize that they should be doing something, but like the most agreeable person will just go along with all of it. And so that's a person who's going to suffer for the sins of others far more than they're going to suffer for their own sin. And then, then that person can be held up as an example to make the other people feel bad for, like, why aren't you being like this? This is what you could be like. And I was thinking about the sitcom that came out a few years back, The Good Place. And, that I think is that kind of reveals the kind of warped viewpoint that, like, a cult can put on people. Because in that scenario, everybody believes that they are in heaven, but for some reason they know as an individual they don't deserve to be there, and they think that they're the only one that doesn't deserve to be there. When in reality, all of them don't deserve to be there, and it's not in fact heaven, but it is hell that they're living in. And so, if you are the person who thinks that who knows that you're worthy of hell and deserving of it because you are cognizant of your own sinful desires, your own corrupt thinking, your own hatred, resentfulness towards others, whether you express it in actual actions or not. We all do that. We all have that disagreeable little thing that makes us feel like we're better than others. And however we choose to deal with it, that's on the inside. And so if we are honest about that and admit that, and we live in that default, then we can receive the good things that happen as pure blessing. And I think that this is the essence of the little clip I shared the other day on my channel. That if God's just telling me to obey these certain laws and I do it, He can ask me to do a certain amount, no more. But if I know that I am totally undeserving, it's not because of anything I did, but because of what He did, then in that sense, there's not really anything that He cannot ask me to do, because I know that I'm totally undeserving of His blessings. I don't have any arguments that I can put forth if I'm going to defend my own actions in comparison to, the perfect life of Christ. And to boil it down to His own example of, what the greatest commands were, I think that Jesus lived a life where He loved God with all of His heart, His soul, His mind, and His strength. And He loved His neighbor as Himself. And it was evident in all of the actions He did. And if you're doing that, it doesn't matter what performative things you do. It doesn't matter what food you eat or what what kind of work you do or any of those things. Because if you're doing those things, you are not sinning. And that's what Paul said, that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And against such things there are no laws. So if you're doing all those things, you're not going to be breaking a law, because those are the right things to do. But if the laws become unjust, then to obey that law of the Spirit and exhibit the fruit of the Spirit may mean that, in fact, you break an actual law. And if people were never, ever willing to do that, we would still be living under the Roman Empire, or we'd still be living under the British Empire, or we'd still be living under kings or dictators or monarchs or something. And, part of our agreeable nature that is lazy a little bit and doesn't want to push back is kind of okay with going back under a system like that. But as for me, I personally am not comfortable with that. And so I'm not going to try to become less. I'm not going to try to become more agreeable. I'm going to try to make sure that the personality that God gave me, the agreeableness and the disagreeableness, is working in submission to His will. And, hopefully, if I am doing that, it means that I'll be able to accomplish the things that He has, planned for me, and it'll produce a good outcome. Because we don't just need more cult followers in this world. There's plenty of those in the world that are listening to all of the lies that they're being told in the media and in culture, and from the wokeists, and the woke religion is totally taking advantage of the agreeable people in our society. And I think the disagreeable people maybe do need to find a little bit of compassion for those who are under that spell, for those who think they're doing the right thing. But that disagreeableness must be directed at those manipulative lies that are keeping people under a burden of performing for a master that will never be satisfied, and that's the definition Tim Keller gives of how an idol works. An idol is a god that is never satisfied with anything we do, and they will always demand more and more and more, and you know that they're not satisfied, and that's why you always end up giving more and more and more, because you think at some point it's going to tip the scales and things will go your way, but it never will. And breaking that cycle of addiction to our idols is really important in learning how we can honor God. And for some people, it might mean that they need to get their disagreeableness under control. But for some people, it might mean they need to learn to have a little bit more backbone and learn to say no to some people that are trying to get you to do things that really are not in your own best interests. So that's my little spiel for today, and hopefully it was coherent and enjoyable. I know it was kind of long. Anyway, thank you.